All right, we should be live.
Hopefully it's better now.
Yeah, it's good. It's all good. All right. Thank you, Waleed and Nousin, for being here today. Thank you, everybody who's tuning in on Facebook Live, and everybody else who will be watching it later. My name is Samia Hassan, and I'm the Executive Director of the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians. Before we get started, I wanted to do a brief territory acknowledgement. The work of the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians takes place on traditional Indigenous territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Allied Nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, Takaranto, the traditional Mohawk name of this area called Toronto, meaning a gathering place, and its surrounding areas are still home to Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to meet, work, and play on this territory as settlers. So today we'll continue our anti-hate series with a discussion on racism within racialized communities and the need for solidarity. And we have Walied Khogali and Nousin Hussain as our guests for today's session. Before we turn it over to our guests for our discussion, just a brief bio, and I apologize, Walied, I had a very difficult time reducing your bio to a short paragraph.
Okay.
Forgive me for reducing the amount that we can say here, but we'll post the full bio in the comment section. So Walied Khogali has worked to champion issues such as affordable transit, environmental stewardship, equity, and human rights in both community and across the city. Since 2016, Walied has worked to support the campaigns of United Way as well as in communications at the Labour Community Services of Toronto. Walied served as the president of the Toronto Environmental Alliance and is a founding member of the transit advocacy organization TTC Riders. Walied has also held key positions in a number of organizations, including the Canadian Arab Federation and One Toronto. Walied is passionate about building a society in which all people can reach their full potential. He is the co-founder of the Coalition Against White Supremacy and Islamophobia. This coalition of 170 plus organizations mobilized a national day of action in February 2017 in response to Trump's administration's Muslim ban and the deadly Islamophobic and racist attack on the mosque in Quebec City in January 2017. Walied, thank you for being with us today. I know that you have not a problem. You have quite a busy schedule and quite a lot on your plate, so really appreciate you being here. Nousin is a Master's of Public Health student at the University of Toronto, pursuing a specialization in social and behavioral sciences. She's currently working at the Center for Global E-Health Innovation at the Toronto General Hospital to create digital platforms for virtual diabetes care. She is a founding member of the South Asian Allyship Network, working to mobilize South Asian communities in Canada to tackle anti-Black racism. Through her work with the South Asian Health Research Hub, she has led participatory research projects engaging community members and key stakeholders in exploring the social dimensions of diabetes, prevalence, and prevention. Her research interests include exploring the nexus between digital health, chronic health, and social inequities. Thank you, Nousin, for being with us here with us today. So again, for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, this series is part of CASA's ongoing anti-hate work that we do in collaboration with our anti-hate community leaders group, which Walied is part of as well. These sessions take place every Tuesday at 4 o'clock and are available to view on CASA's Facebook Live and also are uploaded onto our YouTube channel after the session. We also have somebody on CASA staff monitoring the Facebook Live comments. So if you have any questions that are not part of our moderated session here, we may be able to take some up if you post them before 4:20. So for the last couple of weeks, we've been focusing on the issue of racism within racialized communities and the need for solidarity. And we are talking to individuals today to learn how this solidarity works, what it looks like, and how we can get involved. So let's get into it. So for Nousin, I have a question for you to start. Can you tell us a little bit about the South Asian Allyship Network? What was the rationale behind creating it? What are your goals, and how are you involving the South Asian community in the campaign that you're doing?
Yes, Samia, thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here and share this space with Walied. So we're actually a group of public health professionals who kind of came together, who saw that, you know, there really needed to be some kind of mobilization effort in the local South Asian community in Toronto against the prevailing systemic anti-Black racism that exists in Canada, and to really embark on this journey together on what South Asian allyship looks like and how we can essentially go about supporting the Black Lives Matter movement and understanding essentially and supporting the demands of Black communities. And, you know, just to give a little bit of a disclaimer, we're an extremely new organization and we're still learning and building our network, being extremely intentional with how we grow and how best we can use our platforms to essentially amplify the voices of our Black peers and activists. And the creation of this network was, you know, the rationale behind it was because we essentially didn't see anything like this in the Canadian landscape. And there really being this collective push in the South Asian community. There's amazing activists that have been doing, amazing South Asian activists and Desi activists that have been doing work for, you know, years and decades now. But there, you know, we really wanted to harness this collective effort that's been coming out and this collective mobilization, which we've seen as new. And we wanted to harness this energy and keep the conversation going and action going on how to really enable structural change and not just kind of it being performative and just kind of being a one-term incident. And so, you know, it's been happening for a while in the States of organizations coming together and talking about things, you know, South Asian organizations coming together and talking about anti-Black racism in their communities. But in the Canadian landscape, you know, when something like the death of, you know, most recent death of Regis Paquette happens, you know, there's this outpouring of grief and rightful outrage by the Black community. But you know, the South Asian community, there's not really an infrastructure in place for us to mobilize our collective efforts in a timely and meaningful manner. And so we really wanted to get that infrastructure going and really have that in place. So, you know, the time is now to create that infrastructure and to start beginning to talk about what structural and systemic change looks like. So our goals are essentially to mobilize the South Asian community to address anti-Black racism with our community and support and demonstrate allyship in whatever form that looks like with Canada's Black communities. And we're really attempting to do that by engaging in intergenerational conversations. What we're realizing is a lot of people from like our generation are really vocal in talking about this, but we're having that divide when we get to people of, you know, our parents' age or older relatives. And, you know, even our last event was really geared towards how do we engage in those conversations that are often, you know, we don't often, you know, feel like we have the grit and the patience for. How do we move past that? How do we continuously engage? And we often find it's hard to relay these concepts to our parents and relatives, but it's hard to spur them into action if they don't really understand what's happening. And so we had this first webinar 2 weeks now, and we have our upcoming webinar that's going to be talking about the interconnection between race and systemic factors such as healthcare. And we've invited a panel of medical professionals to tackle this topic and have this discussion on June 29th at 8 p.m. So, you know, please feel free to tune in and check out our event. And that's kind of what we've been up to.
Great. Thank you so much, Nousin. And if you can send us details of that, we'll make sure we share it with our followers, our millions of followers. No problem. Walied, so turning to you, can you, I know we've been discussing a little bit of this before, you and I, about some of the community building work that you've been doing pre and post COVID. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What have you been doing specifically to build race relations?
Thank you so much for that question. I first of all want to acknowledge that, you know, we're on Indigenous land, and every single time I try to have a conversation, I try to bring context to the fact that, you know, Canada is a settler colonial state with a history that we can ignore. So it's crucial for us to set the context for that conversation. So prior to COVID, I've been involved as an advocate, as a community advocate specifically against hate. So my work has been focused on uh, promoting equity by rejecting laws that discriminate based on human traits, and that work has requires a lot of education, but it also requires action. And prior to COVID, one of the events that actually changed my lives was the death of our fellow human beings in Quebec when they were gunned down in a mosque on January 29th, 3 years ago, and it impacted me in realizing that white supremacy is a threat to all of us, and we cannot systemically ignore the impact of white supremacy. So what we did was we started a coalition, the Coalition Against White Supremacy and Islamophobia, which you spoke about. And the reasons why we did that was to have a national action-oriented conversation about the rise of white supremacy and Islamophobia, but also to promote educational opportunities of how to be an ally, and also track incidents of hate and share resources on how best to report and combat the impact of hate. And what we've realized is also there are laws that continue to target racialized folks in our communities. So Bill C-51 is one example, but we also have a very problematic uh, racist, anti-refugee, anti-Black, and Islamophobic exclusion of migrants and refugees within our colonial borders. So, for example, the Safe Third Country Agreement, which bars most refugee claimants entering from the United States overland to claim asylum in Canada. We need to abolish such agreements with a regime south of the border that's invested in white supremacy. So my work prior to pre-COVID is to try to bring folks from different communities, Black communities, brown communities, Asian brothers and sisters, folks from all communities, especially our white allies, together to make sure that we push back against the impact of hate. After COVID, during the pandemic, actually, hopefully after COVID, we'll be able to build a better society that respects human rights. And what I want to say is I'm actually inspired by the community actions that are taking place right now. I started the Ramadan meals program with my good friend, Mr. Kumsa Baker, and folks in Regent Park, and we've been able to serve so many people in our community, especially our indigenous brothers and sisters, and folks who actually have been uh, requiring so much support during this pandemic because of the isolation they were in. And we were able to deliver about 10,523 meals. We partnered up with other organizations such as Food Share Toronto, Cater Toronto, Muslim Welfare Canada, Islamic Relief, to basically make sure that fresh produce was made available to these families. But also during Eid, we were able to deliver toys to kids who were basically in isolation due to the pandemic and were not allowed on the playgrounds. So that's some of sort of the work that I've been involved with in a nutshell.
Great, thank you so much for providing that context, Walied. So, Nousin, in terms of the work that you are embarking on now and based on your previous experience and your contacts with South Asian communities and other communities that are doing solidarity work, what do you find is the most challenging part of doing this work?
I think one of the challenges that prevail in working with kind of other, non-Black racialized communities is we have a tendency to center ourselves in the narrative and kind of talk about our own experiences and our own instances of racism and discrimination. And I think obviously all of that is valid and all of that is extremely important. But our Black members of our Black members of the community have also been experiencing the same kinds of things to a greater degree, and they don't necessarily have we have a much more positive relationship with systemic factors like health and education as compared to members of these communities. And so I think it's been really challenging to translate that information and make especially people of our parents' generation who have struggled and have had their battles to understand that and grapple with that, and to get them to understand that it's showing true solidarity is decentering yourself, and really trying to understand what members of other communities have been through. And we are constantly, having this tendency to put ourselves in the narrative and even start with ourselves. When we talk about things like anti-Black racism in our communities, we have a tendency to start talking about things like colorism and how people within the South Asian communities that are darker have, experiences. But it's about really understanding how those experiences feed into our anti-Blackness and what we can do to motivate change, rather than it really just being about us constantly and being an us first narrative always.
Great, thank you, Nousin. And Waleed, so I'm really interested in this particular question and learning from you. So as a Black Muslim, so you've got, several different social identities that you're carrying with you. So I imagine that you're working to build bridges between both movements, the anti-Islamophobia movement and the anti-Black racism movement. Can you tell us about that struggle? And do you have any stories of success that you can share, and what more needs to be done?
Thank you so much for that question. I really appreciate it. Being Black and being Muslim is not easy. You're basically perceived in different lenses, but it also creates opportunities. And I'll talk about that next. When I'm organizing in our Black communities, especially when it comes to, our pursuit for human rights and justice by, for example, ending surveillance or carding, or basically advocating to support folks in our community by making sure that we basically empower folks in our communities to speak out against racism, to speak out against systemic discrimination, because unfortunately the system has been built in a way that precludes a lot of people from taking action. And it's those folks with privilege that are able to take action. And I actually consider myself as one of those people with privilege, although I am Black and I'm Muslim. I'm also educated, and I'm also a member of many networks that are able to bring about meaningful change, not just through the Coalition Against White Supremacy and Islamophobia, but being part of the student movement, being part of the environmental movement, being part of our labor movement, being part of movements that are part of the counterculture in our society. So that's one thing. Being Muslim also gives me some privilege in the sense that I'm connected to folks, who attend my local mosque, folks who also are connected, spiritually through on-campus clubs, whether it's the Muslim Student Associations or organizations such as the National Council of Canadian Muslims or Islamic Relief. So there are major organizations that advocate in the best interests of Muslims. And sometimes even my Muslim brothers and sisters forget that there's anti-Black racism that exists in their own communities. And those are challenges that must be overcome, because my faith, Islam, does not condone hate in any way. And in fact, actually condemns those that propagate anti-Black racism. One of the most famous figures in Islam, is responsible for the call to prayer, the adhan, which we listen to almost 5 times a day, before we pray. So let us talk about opportunities. I think being Black and being Muslim also provides an opportunity to start having those difficult conversations, in the sense that you're able to be accepted in those communities, but are able to advocate for human rights. You're able to advocate for the facts that we all belong, and most importantly, we have an, a threat, a collective threat, and that collective threat is white supremacy. It impacts Black people, brown people, Asian people, even white people, in a very negative way that could actually have a huge impact in the quality of um, living, like the standard of living actually as well. We're talking about discrimination at the workplace. We're talking about discrimination in business. We're talking about discrimination in government. So how do we ensure that, when folks who are in that periphery, whether they're both Black and Muslim, how are they supported as well? That's something that I always think about, because I understand the challenges that comes with having both those identities. Um, and what I want to say is that it also creates an opportunity to bring those communities together. And we actually saw that yesterday, when many of my friends, and many members of the Black community, and the Black Muslim communities, to be more specific, showed up to the action in Melton in support of the family of Ijaz Ahmed Chowdhury, who was killed on Saturday by officers that work for police, specifically regional police, in the most disgusting manner. This is someone who was asking for help. This is a family that called for support, not to have one of their own been murdered in their own home. And I think, that action that happened yesterday, where folks from so many communities all came down to show support to this family, and also make a commitment that uh, we will honor the legacy of Ijaz Ahmed Chowdhury by basically ensuring that our institutions do not continue to kill us, that we actually put in place the resources that are community informed and community led to support those that are at risk, whether they have mental health issues, whether they've been impacted by poverty, that it's important for us to show them love and support. And that should be done by people living in our community. It just bothers me that we have so many folks who are licensed to carry dangerous weapons who don't even live in our communities. And that's something that we need to change. We need to change how we deliver those important um, services that should be community run and community initiated. And I just want to challenge those that are listening to think about what step they're going to personally take about to combat anti-Black racism specifically, because it has various manifestations, whether it's shadism or in different communities, even in the Black community, right? Like I also challenge my Black brothers and sisters to think about unlearning white supremacy, unlearning the sort of the mental uh, notion that being lighter is being better, right? Which is ludicrous, absolutely uh, something that's deplorable to even think about, right? And I believe Black Muslims are providing leadership when it pertains to this ongoing struggle. I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of folks who, are Black and practice Islam, and have actually found peace and solace in knowing that, what, we could build a world that will challenge, not just challenge white supremacy, but will reject it, and so that our kids and future generations don't have to live in a world where hate is sort of the big elephant in the room, right? In all the spaces, whether it's in our school system, at work, or through community work, or even in our mosques or churches or synagogues.
Great, thank you so much for that, Waleed. So keeping in mind what Waleed has mentioned, Nousin, how do you think that we can build solidarity, and what are some practical ways? So I know there's some theoretical ways, but like, how do we start it? So for people that are kind of just starting from scratch, how do you start it, and then how do you build up?
Yeah, so I think solidarity and true allyship is really about understanding and supporting the needs of Black communities, and especially in a timely manner, and really listening to what they want and what they're pushing for right now. And so just talking from the Toronto perspective and practical next steps, Black organizers are currently clear that what they really want and what they're really pushing for is defunding and abolishing the police. And so we in the South Asian community have to understand what this means. Even for someone like me, like even a couple of weeks ago, I wasn't really familiar with the term. I didn't really understand what this meant, and it's taken some time, but I think we all have to put in the time and effort to understand what those demands are. And so as part of SAN, what we've really been trying to disseminate through our network is talking about this current motion that's been put forward by City Council to cut the Toronto police budget by 10% and reallocating these funds to community resources and community organizations and, support such as mental health support. So I think, and I know this movement's happening locally all over Canada. So really looking for what these bills are, what are these kind of policy level changes that are being put forward, and seeing how we can make that change. Just taking the GTA as an example, South Asians make up a huge portion, and we have information about this on our Instagram. But if you look at the current city councilors that are either opposed or have shown outright support, or have been outright opposed, a lot of them come from hugely dense neighborhoods with South Asian population. So whether that's wards in Scarborough, Flemington Park, Thorncliffe Park, or Crescent Town Vic Park area, these are all neighborhoods where councillors have not openly shown their support for this motion that's being discussed at the next city council meeting on June 29th. So really being aware of things like that, and knowing that you have a voice, and knowing that we South Asians make up a huge population, and where we decide to put our efforts matter. And so, really listening and taking that direction, and then taking the opportunity to also step back and understanding that our attitude and our knowledge and the internal work that we're doing is really something we need to grapple with. A lot of people are very nervous to speak up because sometimes they hear that there's a need to be quiet and give the space to Black members and amplify Black voices, and a lot of times that's valid. Other times, people are telling them to amplify. And going forward, I think we need both, and you have to actively reflect and understand which context is going to require the amplification and which is going to require you to kind of stay quiet and listen and learn. And we also have to kind of understand how anti-Black racism manifests in different systemic and interpersonal ways. And so, currently the push is about police brutality and defunding the police. But, in a couple of months, if it's about education, if it's about health, we have to be ready. We have to be willing to understand and hear this out. And we have to really take in how we as, South Asians have benefited from white supremacy and our proximity to whiteness. in places of work, in places of worship, like at the mosque that we were talking about. A lot of times there's mosques that are specific for certain populations, and we haven't been welcoming to Black voices and haven't been reaching out to our Black brothers and sisters in these religious institutions. So we really need to do that. We need to create that space and understand that when we're talking that we are trying to be inclusive in the language that we use in the khutbahs that we give. It's really important that we're doing all of that and trying to examine what the extension of our privilege is, whether that's at work, whether that's in places of worship, or in our schools as well. And then lastly, I think we need to understand that this is going to be a long-term commitment. The term allyship or allies is not something that we just give ourselves. It's something that, is earned with time and effort and a consistent commitment. When the media stops covering the Black Lives Matter movement, when we stop, seeing Black squares on our Instagram and social media pages, like what are we going to be doing then? That's when I think when true solidarity comes in and you constantly finding the voice and finding the space to talk about these things and amplify Black voices, that's going to be important, because even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's not, even when you're not being kind of coddled by society, and even when it's not kind of politically expedient to talk about these things, that's when it's going to be necessary the most. And that's when that's when our voices are going to be needed to be the strongest.
Thank you so much for that, Nousin. So we have about over time, but I want to hear from Walied about what his advice is on next steps. So if you can cover that in 1 minute,
Sure.
that would be great.
So I had a story to share, but 1 minute's not going to be enough. So I'm going to just talk about the next steps. And I'm glad that my sister Nousin talked about the demands that have been made and the motion that came to council for 10%. To defund the Toronto Police Services, for example, in the city of Toronto, and that's how it has inspired other requests. But what I just want to, I'm going to be honest. To be honest, I know Black Lives Matter also requested defunding of 50% when it comes to Toronto Police Services. That was the most recent demand. But I just want to remind people that are watching this, it's actually a provincial sort of mandate. They have a commission that could actually reverse any cuts that have been made municipally. So I know many politicians are now collecting data from potential supporters, sending out lovely emails saying that they're in solidarity. But I believe that true solidarity is by taking actions, by taking the real meaningful steps to combat anti-Black racism. And the way you deal with it is you give the resources back to the community, so that they're able to meet their needs, their challenges. And also when it comes to safety, it has to be informed by the community and it has to be resourced by the community. So the next steps are very simple. My sister Nousin reminded us about the time when we used to have those little black badges, and BLM was on top of the mainstream cycle, advocating for justice. And then slowly that interest dropped over time. We need to make sure that this movement is sustainable. And the way you go about making a movement sustainable is by getting more people engaged, but most important, informed about what's actually going on. And also making sure that the voices of racialized folks are better represented within government, where decisions are actually being made. And also ensuring that these laws that are racist, that attack our communities, are actually replaced with laws that protect and support communities. And I talked about Bill C-51, I talked about the Cultural Barbarities Act as examples, but we can do so much more. So I just want to challenge everyone that's watching is, what steps are you taking to unlearn anti-Blackness personally, right? It starts with you. And then second is like, what are you doing in your community to unlearn anti-Blackness? Then what are you doing at your workplace to ensure that people, your colleagues, are learning anti-Blackness, right? So change, meaningful change starts with each one of us. And it's not just enough to send an email to elected reps. It's not enough to just show up to a protest or action. It's not enough just to donate to a GoFundMe page because you're feeling you want to support an action, but that's all you can do now. It actually requires your active participation and being cognizant of bias, being aware of your own personal biases and challenging those. So I want to challenge everyone to think that way, to unlearn and to learn, and to help us build a society where hate is not the norm. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Waleed, for that powerful closing. I feel like we should just end the session now, and I don't have to say anything else. But I do want to say that it was really amazing having both of you on this platform, and we're hoping to continue to do these weekly sessions. When I started doing them about 7 weeks ago, some people had said, like, "Are you crazy? You're taking on the task of organizing this on a weekly basis." But we're keeping it simple. But I think the learning that's coming out of it is really worth it.
Exactly.
It doesn't take much time to organize these, but I think just having the people talk about their experiences and their advice and some of the work that's going on has been really worth it for me personally. I enjoy doing them, and I know the people that are watching it definitely enjoy it as well. With that being said, we are taking a break next week, but we'll be back on July 7th. And we'll continue our discussions on anti-hate, and we'll continue our discussion on solidarity and what we can do as South Asian communities in this movement. Thank you to the both of you, and hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, Samia, for organizing.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you, Samia.